Здравствуйте, меня зовут Laura. Это моя канал на YouTube Языки с Laurой. Hello everyone, my name is Laura and this is my channel Languages with Laura. Сегодня and today I would like to talk about language teachers. There are so many different ways that you can learn a language nowadays, and especially with real people. You don't necessarily have to travel to the country, and you don't necessarily have to take a class through a school, a university, community center. You can do it online. There's so many different ways to do that. However, it can be a little tricky. I have always heard that learning a language from a native speaker is the best thing to do, and sometimes it's the only way to do it. And I would like to just have a discussion about this. I'm not trying to say that there is a right way and a wrong way of native speaker teachers versus people who learn the language who are teaching it online, in person. I'm not trying to tell you how to do it. I'm more so just starting a discussion, and I would love to hear your opinions on these points in the comments below, but just remember to keep everything nice. Also note that I will be doing a lot of generalizations in this video. Every single teacher is different. Each individual person and human being is different, and I will be drawing off of my personal experiences learning in school, learning through online platforms such as Lingoda, and being a language teacher myself. I was an English teacher for a year, so I was a native speaking language teacher. I have also been a Spanish tutor, so teaching a language that I also learned. And so with all of these experiences, I thought, let's have a discussion, especially because a lot of times if you're able to learn a language through a native speaker, you're probably paying money in some way, and not everybody can do that. You know, programs like Lingoda and italki, Tandem, things like that, they're great, but for me personally, I cannot afford to do Lingoda lessons consistently to be able to learn a language from beginner to advanced with a native speaker on a platform like this. Also, this video is not sponsored. I hope that is obvious by the fact of me saying I can't afford to use these language learning platforms consistently, that you can tell that this is not sponsored. I still have always wanted to try them. And so my question that I was trying to answer was, is it better to pay for a platform for the beginning of learning the language or closer to the end of learning the language when I'm at a much higher level? So basically what I did is I sat down and I made a pro and con list for native speaker teachers and learned speaker teachers. And I would like to just go through my pro-con list with you. Again, if you have anything to add to these lists, feel free to put them in the comment below. Again, this is just meant to be a discussion. And again, every single teacher is different. Every experience is going to be different, and each learner is different. So this is, like I said, pulling off of my experiences to start a conversation, not necessarily saying you have to use a native speaker for this part or don't use a native speaker or anything crazy like that. So let's start with teachers who learned the language and are now teaching the language. There are some pretty unique pros here, I would say, because the first pro that came to my mind when doing this is because this person has experience studying the language, so they can help you study the language. They have been in your shoes. They know exactly what you're going through. Like, they have put in the effort to do exactly what you're doing, and they know what worked for them, and that's probably what they're going to teach you. Second thing is resources and supplementary materials. Because they had to learn the language and they didn't most likely grow up with it, they most likely had to gather resources and materials to help them learn and practice the language just like you are constantly doing. So they have probably tried a couple different textbooks. They maybe went online and found some YouTubers or some podcasts or TV shows. They will be able to most likely have these recommendations for you to help you in your language learning, even outside of the classroom. I have also found, for my third point, that a lot of the people who learn the language and that are teaching it are very passionate about teaching the language, and a lot of times they are certified teachers or have lots of experience. So you are getting somebody who cares about your education, who cares about the language and cares about sharing it with you and having good experiences, which in my book, has allowed me to have a lot more positive experiences learning the language because of the environment I am in. Of course, there are going to be some cons with a learned language teacher. The little nuances of a native speaker are not going to be there, whether it's filler words or slang materials or perfect pronunciation, things like that. You might not necessarily have with somebody who learned the language, because they might also have an accent and they might not know like the filler words, or however you like to surround yourself with the language. It's all very based off of what they've learned. But again, if a lot of them are certified, they probably do know quite a bit and can help with pronunciation. They just might not be as knowledgeable about various dialects of the language or differences between regions of places that speak that language. But again, you never know. I have found that with some learned language teachers, they are less likely to teach the advanced classes, whether it's because they still might make mistakes when it comes to advanced or harder material, or they are a little bit slower, or they're just used to or more comfortable teaching beginner and intermediate levels. Not a lot of them do advanced classes, so that can also be a setback if you are trying to learn a language and there are very few to no native speaking teachers. The ones who have learned the language and are teaching it might not do an advanced level, which can be a little bit of a bummer. And they can also not necessarily be challenging enough. I remember one of my high school teachers, she was American, she learned Spanish, but she was a Spanish teacher. And by the end of my time in school, I had a hard time talking with her because I felt like she just talked too slowly and she enunciated things too clearly, because she was so used to doing beginner and intermediate level classes, and that's what her ability just needed to be, that I wanted somebody who challenged me, who talked a little bit faster or used more slang. And because of that, I had a harder time understanding native speakers because they would talk so quickly, or they would shorten things. Like, for example, instead of saying para que, they would say pa que. And the first time I heard that, I was thrown through a little bit of a loop because my Spanish teachers never did that, but that's something that developed within the native speaking community as opposed to teachers. All in all, I would say when it comes to a learned language teacher, their pros probably do outweigh the cons, especially if you are at a beginner or intermediate level. It is always good to have someone who knows what you're going through, who is passionate, and who can help you learn the language. Now, moving on to native speakers. Pros for native speakers. Some of them have already kind of been mentioned. They grew up with the language. They are incredibly knowledgeable about the usage of the language. They have, used it their entire lives. They can always correct your mistakes. And they can just really help you feel more fluent and more comfortable with the language. Like, obviously, native professional language teacher is probably the best thing that you can do. Not to discount learned teachers at all whatsoever. But there are some cons, I would say, to having a native speaker be the teacher of your language. First might be that they don't have a language in common with you, and that can be pretty difficult. When I was learning Wolof, I luckily spoke French and my teacher spoke French, and so he taught me the Wolof language through French. And luckily my French level was high enough, but when I did some online courses with other teachers who I didn't have any languages in common with, if I had a question or didn't understand something, it would be very hard to kind of get that explanation or just understand what was attempting to be taught, attempting to be learned. But that can also be nice if you have a language in common that is not your native language, so you can do some language stacking there. So I got to practice my French as well as my Wolof at that time, so. Another con to having a native speaker as your language teacher, especially early on in your language learning journey, can be that sometimes native speakers are not teaching the language from a teaching background. They might not be certified in teaching, they might not be super passionate. It could just be a way for them to make some extra cash, which isn't always the worst thing, and that doesn't necessarily make them a bad teacher, but sometimes they might not be able to answer all your questions, or they're not very invested into actually making sure that you are learning the material. They are just trying to get an easy way to make some extra cash, which I totally understand, but they're not always teachers. And I can relate to this because when I was an English teacher, I was 18 years old, I was fresh out of high school, I did not know what was going on, and I felt so bad for my students because sometimes they would ask me questions about, why is English this way? How can we memorize this? And I'm like, I don't know, because I grew up with the language. I didn't have to study it. I just know that I before E, except after C, except in these like 10,000 other words where it breaks the rule. I'm a little bit older now, so I kind of understand that it has to do with, English borrowing things from different languages, and they have different spelling rules, and things change depending on literacy, and there are so many factors that go into it that I understand now, but I did not understand as an 18-year-old. So me sitting there trying to teach my students without having experienced learning English and without having any sort of background on how to actually teach someone, there were moments where I felt really bad because I was not giving my students the best experience they could have. Especially, I had one class that was a TOEFL preparation course, and that course went very well for the most part because it was an advanced level class. So a lot of these students could already hold conversations in English. They just wanted to work out all the little errors in this. Like, they could have a conversation, but if they conjugate something wrong, or if they speak something without the best pronunciation, I could correct them, but that didn't mean that they didn't know what they were doing. And so most of the time that was really well, but they were constantly asking me questions about the TOEFL, and I was constantly saying, I don't know, I would have to go home and research that because I never had to take the TOEFL. That was the number one thing. They could not wrap their minds around the fact that I never took the TOEFL, but as a native English speaker, I didn't need to take the TOEFL to get into college. I had to take the SAT and the ACT, and those didn't have to do with languages at all. I mean, there's like a reading section and stuff, but not proving that I speak the language. That sometimes with native speakers, they are just on an online platform trying to make some money, and they're not actually really invested into teaching or really the best well equipped to teach the language. The other thing, especially when it's beginner, if they don't speak your language, sometimes you can still get by just kind of by forcing yourself to get through it and kind of start to understand. But they won't always have the best supplementary materials and resources to help you outside of lessons because, again, they grew up in that world. They grew up with that language. They might not necessarily have TV shows or podcasts that are good for beginners. They'll have TV shows that they like to watch, and that can be fine for intermediate or advanced, but sometimes it can be really difficult for a beginner if it's just too fast or complicated materials or, just too much all at once. Not always the best for beginners. So those are all of my pros and cons for both native and non-native speakers who are teachers who are teaching a language. Again, I think that learning a language from a human being is always one of the best things you can do. And whether it's having a one-on-one online, in person, or even just watching YouTube videos of somebody, these are all things to consider when looking for. So in my personal opinion, I think it's best if you can only afford to have a teacher for a short amount of time, either at the beginning or at the end. For me personally, probably more closer to the end or the very beginning, depending on the language. If I were to pick up Italian or Portuguese or Farsi or something very similar to a language I've already studied, I would probably wait to spend money on a native speaker tutor or teacher until later on in the language journeys when I can have full conversations and when I know what I can do so that they can fix me in the little places, the little mistakes here and there. But that's just me. Again, everybody learns differently, everybody teaches differently, and there are so many wonderful platforms and ways to learn a language that I would always recommend taking advantage of that as often as you can. I'm not trying to say do it one way or another. I'm just trying to open a discussion. What are some of the other reasons that you would or would not use a learned language teacher versus a native teacher other than, availability? Thank you all very much for watching. Спасибо большое. And if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Like I said, discussion, so please comment down below your thoughts. And remember, of course, to keep it nice. Comments saying, the only way to learn is from a native speaker, no question. you're not really contributing to the conversation. That's your opinion, and opinions are welcome, but just remember that this is, it's a discussion. Like, why do you think native speakers are the only people to learn a language from as opposed to learned speakers? So just remember to be polite in the comments, but please feel free to share your opinions. And if you like other language learning content like this, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell to be notified as I am posting videos. And so if you don't want to miss those videos, then you should hit the bell so you know when they go up. I'm going to try and post on a regular schedule, again, either every week or every other week. And yeah, I have other social media linked in the description below that you can follow me in my language learning journey and things like that. And yeah, again, спасибо большое, and until I see you all in the next video, пока-пока.